Ask a pilot who flew the L-1011 to describe it. Just that, describe it. Don't ask for specifications or range figures or technical assessments, just ask what it was like, and then watch what happens before he answers. Something crosses his face, not nostalgia exactly, not grief exactly, something that sits between them, in the specific emotional space of someone who once had access to something extraordinary and has spent the years since measuring everything else against it. One retired Eastern Airlines captain, 40 years in aviation behind him, paused for a long time before he said this: "Flying the L-1011 was the only time in my career I felt the aircraft was as serious about flying as I was." The L-1011 didn't win. It didn't save the companies that built it. It didn't define the era the way the 747 did, or persist into the freight world the way the DC-10 did. What it did was show the aviation world, specifically the pilots who flew it, what commercial aviation was capable of being at its absolute best, and they have never stopped talking about it. To understand the L-1011, what it was, what it achieved, and why pilots still speak of it with a reverence that time hasn't diminished, you have to understand the moment it was built for and the company that decided to build it. The late 1960s were a period of extraordinary ambition in commercial aviation. The Boeing 747 had entered development and was about to change what passengers expected from long-haul travel. 500 seats, twin aisles, a standard of space and comfort that made the narrow bodies that had carried the previous generation of passengers feel suddenly and visibly inadequate. The 747 was the future of aviation on the highest volume routes, the transatlantic crossings, the transcontinental corridors, the markets where filling 500 seats was genuinely achievable. But the 747 created a problem as much as it solved one. On routes that were long and important enough to need a wide-body aircraft, but not busy enough to fill a 747 profitably, airlines were caught between options that didn't fit. A narrow body left capacity and passenger experience on the table. A half-empty 747 was a financial problem. The gap between them was a real commercial opportunity, and the major American carriers, American Airlines, Eastern Airlines, Delta, TWA, understood it with the precision of organizations whose survival depended on getting fleet economics right. When American Airlines went to manufacturers with a brief for a wide-body aircraft smaller than the 747 and optimized for the routes where the jumbo was too much, two companies responded with serious proposals. McDonnell Douglas offered the DC-10. Lockheed offered the L-1011. Lockheed was not primarily a commercial aviation company. Its identity and its expertise were rooted in military and defense programs: the C-130 Hercules, the SR-71 Blackbird, the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. These were machines built by engineers for whom performance was the primary metric, and commercial economics were secondary. That engineering culture, the willingness to pursue technical excellence beyond what commercial pragmatism would strictly require, was what Lockheed brought to the L-1011 program, and the aircraft it produced reflected that culture in every design decision. The critical choice that shaped everything that followed was the engine. Lockheed selected the Rolls-Royce RB221, a new high-bypass turbofan that promised noise levels, fuel efficiency, and power characteristics significantly better than what was currently available. The RB221 was, by every engineering judgment, a remarkable engine. It was also a development program that was pushing the boundaries of what Rolls-Royce's financial and engineering resources could sustain. In 1971, Rolls-Royce went bankrupt. The RB221 development cost had exceeded every projection. The British government stepped in, nationalized the company, and continued the program, but the damage to Lockheed's delivery schedule was immediate and severe. Airlines that had been evaluating both the L-1011 and the DC-10 needed aircraft on timelines that the RB221's crisis made impossible to meet. They ordered DC-10s, not because the DC-10 was better. The engineers and pilots who evaluated both knew which one was more sophisticated, but because McDonnell Douglas could deliver and Lockheed could not. Eastern Airlines held their order and waited. Delta held their order. TWA eventually ordered the aircraft. The carriers willing to wait got something that the carriers that ordered DC-10s out of necessity would spend years quietly recognizing as the superior aircraft. They got the finest commercial airliner the wide-body era ever produced. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The L-1011 was different from every other commercial aircraft of its era in ways that pilots felt from the first flight and continued discovering for years afterward. And the depth of those discoveries is precisely why the professional testimony about this aircraft has a quality that testimony about other aircraft rarely matches. Start with the automatic landing system, because it is where the L-1011's engineering ambition was most dramatically visible. Lockheed certified the aircraft for Category 3C automatic landings, the most demanding certification in commercial aviation, allowing the aircraft to land itself in conditions of effectively zero visibility, not reduced visibility, zero. The aircraft would fly the approach, manage the glide path, flare at the correct height, touch down within a defined zone, and roll out to a complete stop, all under automatic control in conditions where the pilots could see nothing outside the cockpit windows. This was not a theoretical achievement. Eastern Airlines used it operationally. Delta used it. In the fog conditions that regularly closed other aircraft operations, the L-1011 kept flying. Pilots who witnessed the first operational automatic landing in genuine zero visibility conditions describe the experience with a specificity and an emotion that suggests they are not simply recounting an event, but revisiting a moment that rearranged their understanding of what aviation was capable of. The direct lift control system was the L-1011's most distinctive operational capability, and the one that pilots describe most consistently as the feature that separated the aircraft from everything else they flew. On conventional aircraft, managing the approach glide path requires adjusting pitch and thrust in a coupled relationship that produces small but continuous corrections. The L-1011's direct lift control used the wing spoilers to adjust lift directly and independently of pitch, allowing the aircraft to steepen or shallow its descent path without changing its attitude. The result was an approach so smooth and so precise that pilots who flew it regularly describe other aircraft's approaches afterward as feeling approximate by comparison. The center engine was fed through a straight inlet in the tail, not the S-duct curve that the DC-10's tail arrangement required, which meant cleaner airflow and better efficiency. The Rolls-Royce RB211 engines that powered the aircraft were, once they reached operational maturity, quieter and more fuel-efficient than the competition. Passengers sitting in L-1011 cabins noticed the sound first, or rather, the absence of it. The aircraft was remarkably quiet for its size and era, and that quietness created a cabin environment that felt qualitatively different from what most wide-body travel produced. The wing was an achievement that aerodynamicists studied for years. Its design produced favorable lift characteristics across a wider range of speeds and configurations than the competition, which meant the aircraft behaved consistently and predictably at every phase of flight. Pilots describe this consistency as trustworthiness, the specific quality of a machine that does the same thing in the same conditions every time, that doesn't produce surprises at the edges of its envelope, that tells you the truth about what it is doing and what it is about to do. The flight deck reflected Lockheed's military engineering heritage in the best possible sense, designed with systems logic that rewarded complete understanding with complete transparency. Every system told you its state. Every anomaly announced itself clearly and early. The aircraft had no hidden behaviors. What you saw was what you got. And what you got was more than any other commercial aircraft of the era was offering. The human experience of the L-101 has a texture that distinguishes it immediately from the testimony about other aircraft, because it comes from people who are not just remembering something they flew or traveled on, but something they measured everything afterward against. Pilots who flew the L-101 as their primary type describe a relationship with an aircraft that is unlike anything else in their professional accounts. The Eastern Airlines crews who operated it from Miami, the Delta pilots who flew it through Atlanta, the TWA captains who took it across the Atlantic. They talk about the aircraft the way people talk about a mentor, something that made them better at what they did by demanding more of them than they had previously been asked to give, and then delivering in return a standard of performance that justified every demand. One captain who flew L-101s for Delta for 14 years describes the approach as the moment that defined the aircraft for him every flight. Not the automatic system, though he used it and trusted it completely. The manual approach, in the conditions where the direct lift control made the aircraft feel like it was reading his intentions rather than waiting for his inputs. The glide path holding steady without the small corrections that other aircraft required. The touchdown arriving not as a managed arrival, but as a natural conclusion to a sequence that had been precise from the moment the approach began. He flew that approach thousands of times. He says he never got tired of it. The flight attendants who worked at L-101's routes describe a cabin environment that made their jobs manageable in the specific ways that long sectors make management necessary. The aircraft was quiet. The ride was smooth. The passengers, and this is a consistent observation across multiple cabin crew accounts, were calmer on L-101 flights than on comparable aircraft. Whether this was the smoothness communicating through the airframe, the quietness reducing the ambient stress of the environment, or simply the confidence that a well-run operation inspires in the people it carries, the result was a working environment that flight attendants remember with specific and genuine appreciation. The mechanics who maintain the RB211 engines have their own chapter of the L-101 story, one that is honest about the engine's difficult early years and equally honest about what it became once those years were behind it. The development problems were real, the consequences for Rolls-Royce were historic, but the mature RB211 was an engine that experienced mechanics describe with professional respect, powerful, consistent, and, once properly understood, rewarding to maintain in ways that complex but logical systems always reward expertise. The L-101 conflict was the most elegant and most devastating in commercial aviation history because it had nothing to do with the aircraft itself and everything to do with timing, dependency, and the brutal commercial logic of an industry that rewards availability over excellence. Rolls-Royce's bankruptcy was the original wound. The delivery delays it created were not recoverable in a market where airlines needed aircraft on specific timelines and competitors could deliver. American Airlines took DC-10s. United took DC-10s. The window that the L-101 needed to establish itself in the market closed while the RB211 development crisis played out, and by the time Lockheed could deliver at the pace a market required, the market had already distributed its loyalty. The financial consequences for Lockheed were severe. The L-101 program required sustained investment that the commercial return never fully justified, partly because of the delayed market entry, partly because the aircraft's technical sophistication made it more expensive to build than the DC-10, and partly because the twin-engine wide-body aircraft that Boeing and Airbus were developing were beginning to redefine what airlines needed from a long-haul aircraft. Eastern Airlines, the L-101's most committed operator, ran into its own financial difficulties through the 1980s that had nothing to do with the aircraft and everything to do with the deregulated airline environment's effect on a carrier whose cost structure couldn't adapt quickly enough. Eastern's eventual bankruptcy and dissolution removed the L-101's most visible and most operationally sophisticated operator from the market. The aircraft was retired from major airline passenger service in the early 1990s, not because it had failed, not because it was unsafe, not because something better had replaced it in any absolute engineering sense, but because the economics of operating a trijet in an era of increasingly reliable twin-engine widebodies no longer justified the fuel and maintenance costs relative to the alternatives. It was retired because the world had changed around it. The aircraft itself had not changed. It was, at retirement, essentially what it had been at entry into service, the most technically sophisticated commercial aircraft of its generation, doing everything it had always done to the standard it had always maintained. The L-1011's legacy exists in two places that have nothing obvious to do with each other and everything essential in common. The first is in the professional memory of the pilots who flew it. The L-1011 community, the captains and first officers and flight engineers who spent careers on the type, maintains a quality of organizational memory and mutual recognition that is unusual in aviation. They know each other by what they flew. They recognize in each other the specific standard that the aircraft established and that nothing afterward quite replicated. The L-1011 didn't just give them an aircraft to fly. It gave them a benchmark, a point of reference against which everything in their subsequent careers was, consciously or not, measured. The second place is in the engineering philosophy that the L-1011 demonstrated and that the fly-by-wire aircraft of the current era eventually implemented. The idea that an aircraft should actively help its pilots rather than simply respond to their inputs, that automation should augment professional judgment rather than replace it, was central to the L-1011's design philosophy and is now central to every modern commercial airliner. The L-1011 didn't invent fly-by-wire, but it proved in operational service across 2 decades that the relationship between pilot and aircraft could be something more collaborative and more sophisticated than anything that had previously existed in commercial aviation. The aircraft that followed learned from that proof. Lockheed never built another commercial aircraft. The L-1011 was the beginning and the end of their commercial program, one extraordinary excursion into a market that rewarded them with professional respect and penalized them commercially for the timing of a partner's collapse that was beyond their control. One aircraft, one chance, and an achievement that the people who experienced it are still, 50 years later, trying to find adequate words for. We began with a pilot who needed longer than expected to answer a simple question. Describe the L-1011. Now we know why he paused, because describing the L-1011 accurately requires describing something that doesn't have a comfortable category in the standard vocabulary of aviation assessment. It wasn't the most commercially successful aircraft of its era. It wasn't the one that defined the market or outsold the competition or kept its manufacturer in business long enough to build a successor. What it was is harder to say and more work saying. It was the aircraft that showed commercial aviation what it was capable of being when engineering ambition was allowed to run ahead of commercial pragmatism. When the question asked was not what can we build that airlines will buy, but what is the best commercial aircraft we are capable of building. The answer to that question, the L-1011 TriStar, lost the battle it fought and won the argument it made. The pilots who flew it know this. They knew it at the time, and the decades since have only confirmed it. They talk about it still because it represents something in their professional lives that is difficult to replace once you have experienced it. The specific confidence of operating a machine that was better than it needed to be, designed by people who cared about what better meant, for passengers who felt the difference even when they didn't know what they were feeling. The L-1011 is gone from commercial service. The argument it made is still being made in every fly-by-wire aircraft that manages its own envelope, in every automated approach system that lands when the pilots cannot see, in every piece of aviation engineering that asks the question the L-1011 first asked commercially: what is the best we can do? The L-1011 answered that question once, completely, and retired undefeated. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.